How's everybody doing today? Little sunfish fishing. Welcome to Ask an Angler. Today we are going to be going over everything sunfish related. So for some of you that's bluegill, for some of you that's red ear, for some of you may call them perch. But we're going to be talking about how you're going to go after sunfish at this time of year. We've had a wacky spring full of lots of wild weather, not in the typical Oklahoma fashion, more of the Canadian fashion this year, but we're still catching fish. So we're gonna help you guys out as we get into sunfishing season right now. At any time during this, please put your comments and questions into the chat bar. This is meant to be conversational, so I have a loose agenda of stuff I'm going to cover, but if I'm moving too fast, or maybe I was talking about something and it, sparked an idea about something you might think about, just put that in the chat bar and we'll address them as we go. And then we'll kind of do a Q&A once we get to the end. But anyways, let's kick this off. Sunfish are awesome. They're one of my favorite fish to catch, especially in ponds this time of year. They, they can put a hurting on a microlight rod, especially anything over like 3/4 of a pound. So we're pretty much going to be talking about like red ear, bluegill, green sunfish, and long ear sunfish. And then any of the hybrids that may come either naturally or stuff that we stock. So all of our bodies of water that we stock with sunfish, which is primarily close to home areas, they are blue-green crosses. So your green sunfish is going to be the smallest of your sunfishes, but it's got a mouth on it that's like that big. So because they're voracious feeders, can inhabit, very low oxygenated bodies of water. So if you have them in a pond or something like that, your green sunfish can live in just creeks with barely any water, ponds with barely any water. So they're a great cross species to put with a northern strain copper-nosed bluegill, because a copper-nosed bluegill can get up to, in a fish tank, that fish can get up to 4 pounds. In certain parts of Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, places that have really, really big natural bluegills, you might get a natural fish that's like 3 pounds, 3.5 pounds. Oklahoma, our state records for our sunfish kind of hover in that 1.5 to just over 2 pound range. It's not to say that there's not bigger fish out there to be caught. There's probably been, close to a 3 pound bluegill that's been caught out of a pond that's just never been turned in as a record because it ended up in a fish fry. Nothing wrong with that. So, but that's what we're going to be talking about. We have lots of sunfish species in the state. There's like rock bass, pumpkin seed sunfish, whole plethora of sunfish that exist in our clear water creeks on the eastern side of the state. But for the majority of us, we're looking at, copper-nosed bluegill, our green sunfish, our red ear sunfish, and our long ear sunfish, and then any hybrids of those. So we're going to go over how you get them at this time of year. So today is, May 11th. So we're just kind of getting into bluegill spawn, sunfish spawn, perch spawn, however, whatever vernacular you need to describe the fish, it's that time of year. Fish around me, I'm in central Oklahoma. I'm based out of Oklahoma City. I fish a lot of ponds in and around neighborhoods that I live in Edmond, and those sunfish are making their beds. So I fish Lake Hefner a lot. Lots of big bluegill are moving up pretty close to their spawning areas. So we're really close. Anybody on the southern part of the state who might be on this call, anybody in the central part of the state to the south who has ponds, you're in them right now. So we're going to go over all the different which ways you can catch sunfish, where to target them, how to get after them in numbers. It's kind of hit or miss. If you're in a pond, you probably have a couple of decent sized fish in there. But if it's an HOA, if it's a close to home, if it's your own private pond, you know, a lot of that is just user trial and error, surveying your fish through catch. What is the average size of fish I catch? What do they look like when they're on their beds? When I pull them out, are they bluegill? Are they ready, or are they a red blue cross? Are they a blue green cross? You know, things like that. So we're going to go over all that. So I'm going to start it off with just the basics. I don't do a lot of time on these Asking Anglers on bait fishing. Kind of developing a deal on our website at our fishing resources page, which will have lots and lots of bait fishing tactics coming up here in the next couple of weeks for all species. But these Asking Anglers are kind of geared towards fishing with artificial. But with sunfish, that's the one species where we're going to split this up 30%, 70%, as opposed to when I've done bass and crappie and everything else that is more like 10% bait, 90% artificial. So we're going to start this off with what your most effective way to catch sunfish for everybody, whether you're fishing from a boat, a kayak, from the bank, with kids, with people who've never fished before, for people who've fished for 50 years. This is how you're going to catch the most sunfish at this time of the year. Your small hooks. So this is one that everybody's seen. This is an Aberdeen hook. It's got a very long shank on it, but it's a very small hook. If I pull that up to my fingernail, you know, there's your hook point. Not very big, smaller than my fingernail. But it's got the big long shank on it. So when the fish hits it, goes into its mouth, here's the front of the mouth, you're hoping that that's what it looks like when that fish comes in. Because that way you can just grab this with your hands or pliers and then push up to pop the hook point out. So most people use long shank hooks. Nothing wrong with that. Perfectly fine. Here's something kind of in between. This is more of a bait shank holding hook. You can see the little barbs off the back of the hook shank there. Those will hold your worm as you put it on, or your, you know, whatever bait you're using. But again, real small. Barely the size of my fingernail. Myself, I'm very partial to as small of a hook as you can get. So I use a very small little double wide octopus hook. So that's, you know, about half of a fingernail. This one, again, you have to pay attention if you're using a bobber, if you're fishing off the bottom, if you're fishing with no float. You know, you got to be able to set the hook fast, because if they get any of these back down towards the gills, unless you plan on keeping them and cleaning them, you know, you're better off just cutting the line, because, you know, you're going to kill them. Anything that's back here, you know, towards those gill plates, if it's in the roof of the mouth, if it's in the gullet, if you ever hooked a fish in the back where they have the hook and they kind of have that, you know, balloon knot in the back where their gullet goes in, and that hook is just like right there. You know, a little pair of forceps, you might be able to get it and pull it out, but more than likely the fish is, you know, going to be flaring out its gills and you're going to hit something like that. So unless you plan on keeping them, always cut the hook if they get it way in the back. But these hooks are cheap. They come in, you know, 20 pack, 30 pack for like $2. So you can get a ton of these. Now you got two options to fish when you have, or three options to use when you're just using a hook. The first way and the easiest way is with a bobber. I prefer a stick bobber over a round bobber. A stick bobber, I can fish it two ways. I can either put on a few different options of split shot. So with this bobber, this is kind of a medium-sized stick bobber. It's a little bit bigger than the ones that I typically use. So this smallest split shot, probably not going to be your best bet. It won't stand it up straight, which is what most people are looking for. So you probably want to elect for, you know, a bigger size split shot, maybe a medium-sized split shot. But if you don't put on split shot and you cast this bobber out, it hits the water, it's going to lay like this. No weight. You have your worm And I don't have any natural worms with me, but I'll kind of show you guys like a little tip. If you fish for catfish or something like that, and you just want to catch some bait along the riprap, take, just a little grub or something that you have, an old worm, something that you've used. And all you have to do is just cut off that tail, like just pull it off like that. So you end up with this. Well, if you put that on your hook, we'll use this as a reference for how much, like if you use a night crawler or red worm or something like that, you should never be putting more worm on your bait for sunfish than this. So if you have your worm, right, it's hanging off, you don't want that. Because all they're going to do is they're going to hit this, they're going to hit this, they're going to hit this, they're going to tear it. You're never going to set the hook. Your bobber's going to be going crazy. So make sure when you're using bait, especially worms, people have a tendency to hang them off the edge. So you just kind of want to work them up the hook shank like that. So that's what, if you had a natural worm, and you might even elect to throw that over one more time. So it's just like that. That's what your worm should look like. If you have a night crawler, a red worm, green worm, whatever, that's what it should look like. You shouldn't have anything hanging down below the turn on the hook, because those fish are just going to come up. They're going to steal your bait. You're going to get frustrated. Bobber's going to be going up and down. And that's why I elect for a stick bobber. So most of the time, especially on windy days, because windy days are a nightmare. So if you have wind blowing from north, south, east, west, and you have a bobber on the water, your bobber is just doing this. The current's pushing everything. So I'll take the weight off so my bobber just floats on the water like this. If anything touches my hook, doesn't matter. It's going to do something. So ideally, if a big fish hits it, it's going to go and it's going to shoot under. But most of the time, it just kind of ticks, does something like this. That indicates to me that there's a fish there. So I start reeling up the slack to where I can feel tension with that hook point. And then if it's still doing that, well, then you go to set the hook. But if you have your piece of split shot on a calm day, then your bobber should stand straight up like this. Well, that bluegill or green sunfish or red ear, whatever comes along, should suck it right under. Not a lot of tension, not a lot here to prevent it. That's why I don't like round bobbers, because round bobbers, they roll, they do this. This is a lot of tension on the water's surface to break the surface. So if you get a fish, especially like crappie, but even some big sunfish, they might come up and they might upbite. So they're going to come up to your hook and they're going to hit it like this. And instead of grabbing it and diving right back down, they might just hold it right there. You'll never notice that bite. You'll reel up after 20 minutes having your bobber out there. All your bait's going to be gone. You're like, how did my bait get taken? I never saw my bobber go under. I've been watching it the whole time. That's elect for stick bobbers or slip corks or something that's just not a lot of tension on the water surface. So that's kind of your position A for fishing, is with your small hook, piece of split shot, or not if you want to let your stick bobber lay like this. But if you want to put on split shot, again, stick bobber is still going to be your best option. But that's the easiest way to do it. So you can use a piece of an old soft plastic that you have. Just rip the tail off just like that. Let it float under. You'll get bit, especially this time of year. But most times of year, you can catch fish on riprap, things like that. This is typically what I do when I'm not going to catch sunfish or bait fish. If I'm going to catfish or something like that, I'll just bring some old plastics that I have lying around, rip off the tail, and just use that to catch my bait. And then I cut the bluegill in half. Another way that you can bait fish for bluegill in bigger bodies of water, so a big reservoir. So what I just described works best in ponds, backwaters, creeks, things like that. If you're on a big reservoir and you kind of don't know where to start, everything kind of looks the same, you got tons of water. Well, at this time of year, another way you can do it is you can use a bottom rig. The easiest way to do it is get yourself a Lindy Rig. Lindy rigs are sold at Cabela's, Bass Pro, probably Academy, a lot of other sporting goods stores. So you already have your hook and line ready. And then they either come with a 1/4 ounce weight or a 1/2 ounce weight. And the way that these are built are these are non-snag weights. So when you cast them out there, you reel up your tension. It's not going to get wedged in anything. You very rarely ever just get stuck on the bottom with these. So you put this behind the swivel that your Lindy Rig comes with, which is going to look something like this. So you're going to tie your main line on to the main eyelid. And then on the back, you can see it looks a little different. And the loop knot that is in that Lindy Rig on the line with the hook, you're just going to slide that through kind of the maze. So I'll do it for y'all. So it's kind of like a trout hook, you know, kind of how they have like snell knot hooks that they sell. I'm not going to unwind all this, but basically the little loop that the line is attached. So you would unwind all this line. It's basically just wrapped around 4 or 5 times. You do that, it'll all come out. And you just take that end, and then where that little notch is at, you just slide that right in between, and then you just pull it all the way down. Just kind of work it down to where it gets down to the bottom, and then it's like that. So now it's on your swivel. So you can do this, cast that out with your worm on again. Still, even with bluegill, if you're on the bottom, you might leave a little bit of a tag end, like especially with like red worms that aren't as big as night crawlers. The red worm will actually kind of help you because it'll be on the bottom. And if you leave like, you know, the knuckle of your finger up length of worm, it's going to do this on the bottom. And you can, if you can target where you can find like sunfish, you'll catch some really big sunfish. It's not an easy bite. You're going to get the little dink, dink, dink on the tip of the rod tip. But you can't just go to pull because, you know, a bluegill's mouth is only about that big. So it's just grabbing the end of that worm, end of that worm, end of that worm. Most of the time you leave it, keep your drag set real loose, or even open up your bail and let something, especially if you're planning on keeping fish to clean, just leave your bail open. They'll grab it. They'll start swimming. Just watch where your line is in the water. If your lines move 15 feet that way or 15 feet that way, lock the reel and start reeling up. But you're going to get a lot of other bycatches. So depending on what type of body of water you're on, you could have walleye, sockeye, drum, carp, largemouth bass, catfish. You know, it opens up the entire playbook when you're down on the bottom. But for sunfish, you know, backs of marinas, backs of coves, backs of creek arms, those fish want to spawn in 2 feet of water or less. And in clear water, you're going to be able to see, you know, what those beds look like. They're going to be, you know, dinner plate, soccer ball sized around like that. And it's going to look like just loose sediment. You know, it's going to be very easily distinguishable, usually because they do it through like bottom weeds, bottom grass. So you'll see this circle, and then right in the middle will be a dark spot, and that's where they dump hard debris, little sticks, rocks, anything, so that when they lay the eggs, that, you know, the eggs get aerated when they're on there. So that's kind of it for bait. You know, you can use crickets, you can use grasshoppers, you can use, I like crappie nibbles at this time of year, kind of no hassle. You don't have to keep them refrigerated. They don't make a lot of a mess. Once those fish move up onto their beds, which is really, you know, the best time of year to target sunfish in bulk numbers, crappie nibbles are great because worms, you might leave them sitting in the car in a backpack and it's hot outside. And, you know, next time you get in your car, it's a nasty, raunchy mess of a smell. Same thing with crickets, leeches. You can use like a bag of corn. So like microwave heatable corn that comes in the bag, or a can of corn. All of that works at this time of year. You're looking to just put a really, really small offering on a really, really small hook, preferably on areas where you can find beds. So if you're fishing a pond or a creek, look for those areas because you're going to be able to see them. The water is going to be clear enough. You're going to see those dinner plate size circles all clustered together. And at this time of year, you're probably going to see the fish sitting on them. Your bigger female fish are going to be just off the back sides of where those clusters of beds are at. But like I said, we're in it right now. This weather has been all sorts of funky. This spring, we got crappie that are still trying to spawn. We have white bass still trying to spawn. We have largemouth bass that are kind of in their spawn. They're sucking in and out. You have sunfish now that it's like, it's our time. We're moving up, but you have all these other species. So each body of water right now is going to be very different. Even from pond to pond in your own neighborhood, it might be different. But it is that time of year. These fish, all fish are active right now. Water temps throughout the state are now finally probably into the, if not at the very least, very high 50s, low 60s, and in some cases mid to high 60s. So every fish that has not had 2, 3, 4, 5 days of sustainable weather for them to, go do their spawning, they're there. They're feeding. They're just going through the cycle. So fishing is really, really good right now statewide. These cold days come in. It might screw up a little section of the body of water you're fishing on, but these fish are ready to go. So don't let days like today deter you. I haven't looked at the extended forecast because the last time I did, it burned me like 6 days later. It said it was going to be 85 and sunny, and it's 55 and raining. So, maybe only look 2 or 3 days out, but fishing is on right now. And in most cases, every species and every body of water of the state. So that takes us kind of through the bait. That's your best bet. You're going to catch the most numbers of fish using a red worm, a night crawler, a kernel of corn, or a crappie nibble on some type of size 6 Aberdeen hook, so a real small one, or a size 6 or 8 octopus hook or bait shank hook with either a piece of split shot, no piece of split shot, and a bobber. That is your best bet. And that bobber should only be, at this time of year, you should be no more than a foot above the eye hole of your hook. So you really only want to be about this. That's about, 10 inches. When they're really, especially in ponds, those fish are in 2, 3, 4 inches of water. I've fished for them before where I literally only have the bobber 2 inches above where the eye hole is. So that kind of comes down to the angler. What do you see in front of you? What are you looking at? Do I see fish? Water's only this deep. Okay, I need to move my bobber up. But you're never going to catch more fish than you will at this time of year for sunfish using anything other than a red worm, a night crawler, a cricket, a kernel of corn, crappie nibble, something like that. So then that kind of brings us into all the artificials, everything else. So we're going to go over artificials and fly fishing of how you can catch these things. So I'll look at this question. Will red ears do good in a farm pond? I have a pond that's about 2 acres that only has bass and hybrid bluegill in it. I would like to focus my pond on trophy bluegills. So red ear, green sunfish, and bluegill are going to be most of the primary species of sunfish that you can stock into a small body of water. But what you're going to want to do with that, so red ears and bluegills, kind of similar, kind of not. So red ears are going to be the hardest to catch overall. At this time of year, it doesn't really matter. They're all moving up onto their beds. They all bite pretty good. The other 11, 10 months of the year, red ears are going to inhabit the deepest water around the heaviest bottom cover and structure. So root wads, stumps, submerged timber, brush piles, grass, weeds, anything they can suck themselves into. Bluegill and green sunfish are going to go just a little bit away from where their bedding areas are at. So they like to bed up on shelves, shallow bays, coves. They're not going to swim way out into the middle of the lake, way out into the middle of the pond, without having a good structural highway to get there. So they're going to ride those kind of shallow drop-offs, but your bluegill are going to hang a lot closer to those throughout the course of the year. Your green sunfish, they probably won't even get off that shelf. Your green sunfish are going to inhabit the shallowest of the water year round. So they're going to be tucked heavy to cover and structure right up against the bank, holes in the bank, things like that. So if you want to grow big sunfish in your own pond, if maybe you go to a city lake or close to home or something like that, that you notice, you fish it enough, you realize, oh, there's not, a bunch of people taking fish out of here, then unfortunately close to home, you can't keep bass. But if you have your own pond or a neighborhood pond, keep bass, get bass out of there, especially big bass. So if you want to grow, 10, 11, 12-inch sunfish, bluegill, red ear, blue-red hybrids, blue-green hybrids, to get them to that 11, 12-inch range, naturally, you don't want to have more than, a half a dozen, maybe a dozen fish in your pond that are bass that are over 2 pounds, because a 2-pound bass, his mouth's going to be about that. 3-pound bass is going to be like that. 4-pound bass is going to be like that. And then you start getting into the 5 and 6. They can eat 6, 7, 8-inch bluegill, 8-inch crappie, things like that. So you want to grow real big sunfish. Get rid of your big bass. Make sure that your bass are 12 to 15 inches. They'll help kind of competitive balance your bluegill and your red ear and any of your sunfish that are spawning. They're going to come in. They're going to eat fry. Another thing is don't have crappie in your pond. If you have crappie are going to decimate your bass and sunfish eggs and fry because they spawn first. So they go up, they do their thing. All your sunfish and bass are still kind of lethargic, cold weather, cold water. Those crappie go up, they spawn, they kick out. Okay, water temps have gotten bigger or hotter, and their fry are now, this big. They've had a month to spawn, so they kick out. Now your bass and bluegill move up. Well, all of those crappie come right back into the bank to eat all of those eggs and fry that your bass and bluegill. So if you want to have monster sunfish in your private pond, no crappie, and if possible, no bass. But if you do have bass, make sure they stay no bigger than 15 inches. Anything over that, they're going to be able to start eating those 3, 4, 5-year-old sunfish that are starting to get 6, 7, 8 inches. So that's kind of from a management perspective of that. So let's get into the artificials of what we have. I'm kind of partial to like 2 or 3 baits for artificial, but we'll run through everything because every body water is different. You might find success on the small body water that you fish that I don't have to worry about, where I fish. So we'll go through everything, but I'm going to start with the stuff that I just, hands down can't go sun fishing without it. That's not bait. And again, night crawlers, red worms, crickets, grasshoppers, corn, crappie nibbles. You might try leeches, but again, you don't want to have a huge offering on your hook. So if you have worms and that's the hook point, remember, don't have a lot of hanging excess below the hook turn, because those fish, they'll just come up and they'll do this, and you're going to be getting bit, trying to set the hook. You're going to get frustrated. Those fish have never touched your hook point. Make them come to your hook point. Don't assume that they'll get the hook point. So always keep your offerings completely tied in on the hook. Don't leave a whole lot of excess for sunfish. It's not necessary. All right, so my favorite for everything pond fishing is tubes. Green Pumpkin, Red and Black, Squirm and Squirt, Crappie Max, Bass Pro brand. This is an 1.5 inch. This is a 2-inch, same body, just a little bit longer skirt. I only keep 2 types of jig heads. or two sizes of jig heads. I keep these. Bass Pro makes the Squirming Squirt jig heads that you can pair with them. They have the long lead bodies, hook point. So I have a 16th ounce and a 1/32 ounce. I almost exclusively use a 1/32 ounce. Now, I mentioned a 16th ounce. These are hard to cast, especially if you're using open face spinning reel. You need to have a rod that is a light action, 6 foot, 4'6" to 6 foot, but with like 4-pound test. Because when you go to throw something that's that small and that light, especially if the wind's blowing in any direction, you're going to go throw it off way too hard. You're not going to load the tip of the rod. When it comes through your spinning reel, all that line, bird's nest. Everybody's done it. I do it on windy days. I mean, it happens. But for consistency, if you need a little extra help, throw on a 16th ounce to start and then work your way back to a 1/32. But basically, these are hollow tubes like this, and then this body is meant to go through it. So instead of using something like a round jig head like that, where it's just got the head on it and nothing on the shank, with tubes like this, you want to use something that's got a full body weight that goes through it. Because when you internally rig these things, you just go right up through the shell of the body, and then that little nose, you just pull up, plastic will pop right through. But now, when I squeeze the body, it's hard all the way through. There's no airspace. So when a fish comes up and grabs the body, if I was on one of these, round head with the plain shank that's on it, fish comes up and grabs the tube down here. It's got that air pocket. So those, fish have kind of like sandpaper teeth. They'll hit it and man, they can rip a tube in half on the first fish. If you use a tube jig head to go with your tube, you're going to, it's not to say that one fish won't tear it on the first time, but more than likely your odds go up for being able to catch 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 fish on this before you have to change out your tube. Because when you use those little circle heads, like you would with something like this, like a baby shad, well, you don't rig your tubes like you do, a grub or something like this. So if you have your little soft plastic and you rig it up on something like this, where you go through the nose, and again, these are great for sunfish, little baby shad. They're awesome. When you run those on there, fish comes up, you're going to get your tail bit off, whatever. But when you're done with it, when they destroyed the soft plastic, well, you can just pull the soft plastic right off. You can't do that with this when you're tied on to the hook shank. So the only downfall of using these little tubes, which, again, this exact make and model, a 1.5 inch Squirm and Squirt green pumpkin with red and black flake on a 1/32 ounce Squirm and Squirt head, there isn't a better artificial. You weed out a lot of 4-inch fish with this, so you're catching 6, 7, 8, all the way up to 12-inch sunfish. With this color, you can use this from the southwestern corner of the state to the panhandle to the northeastern part of the state, south, doesn't matter. This is your winner. If you want to use artificial for sunfish and you're not fly fishing, this is it. There's nothing that will outfish this, I promise it. But you got to break them off every time. So once it's done, once they've torn off a bunch of the legs and your tube looks something like this and it's a little haggard and you got to get rid of it, well, you have to clip it off and then you have to retie on. But they come in a little 15 pack. So I'll just buy a pack of squirt heads to go with it, and I'll pre-rig them, put them back into the plastic pouch, and then they'll fit right into my pocket. So really, really, really simple to use. But that's the only knock on these, is that you can't just pull the plastic off, put a new one on. So most people see stuff like this for crappie, lots of baby shad. All of these are good colorations for sunfish. Again, their movement at this time of year, your big females are going to be hanging right off on the back sides of where you see those bedding areas. All the males will be pushed up. They're doing all their work. They're cleaning the beds off. They're, running each other off, trying to get position A to attract in a female to come lay eggs and do all that. So until they're actually spawning, which in some places is right now, but really in the next couple of weeks, if you want to try to target some of those bigger fish, look at, you can fish any time of day. Your mornings and your evenings, you're going to get more of a bite, but really it's all day long right now. So if you're looking for some bigger fish, especially if you're bait fishing, cast out a couple of yards beyond the end of where you can kind of see the bedding area, out into that deeper water, especially if there's like a log that's down, a tree that's down, grass mats or something that's grown up. Your biggest fish are going to be just sitting right there waiting, because female fish during the spawn, they just jump right up. They lay eggs, they get back out. They're not involved in the building the bed process. Those males are just going to go after it. So those females just come up when they're ready, then they drop their eggs, and then they kick back out. So if you want to catch the bigger fish, especially on ponds, because big fish is relative, right? So you can clean any sunfish that's over 6 inches. The best cleaning fish are going to be between 8 and 12, but 12 inches is, that's a monster sunfish. A 12-inch sunfish is, a pound and a half, pound and 3/4 sometimes. So you're really looking to hover in between 8 and 10 inches for fish that you can eat and fillet. That's the size you're looking for, is like right in there. So on some bodies of water, those might be the spawning male fish. I mean, you might just have a really healthy population of bigger fish. But if you're just pulling like 4, 5, 6-inch sunfish off of the beds, then you're just catching those males. So cast out just a little bit deeper. Maybe if you're using a bobber, cinch it up 6 inches and cast just out past the end of where those beds are at. And you'll typically find your bigger fish at this time of year. So these are kind of like your basic starter kits, right? Everybody's seen these at Bass Pro, Cabela's, Academy, Walmart. We've all seen these, right? There's nothing wrong with them. They're going to catch fish. But I'm a big advocate of trying to keep it as natural as possible. So while, yes, you will get bit on, a hot pink, something like this, if you're fishing stained water or muddy water. So let's start with this. If you're fishing a clay stained pond, a red pond, you want to keep your colorations either white or red. So, and especially in clay stained water, going for something like a grub or a tube, you better know where they're at. You're better off fishing with bait when you're in that really stained water. Give off scent, a little bit of a pulse from that live piece of worm or cricket or whatever, kind of, moving, give off. It'll stimulate the lateral line. But if you're fishing in like red water, you want to elect probably, if you're not going to use bait, again, bait number one, worm on a bobber. You can't beat that. But you might want to go for, something like a box that's got like some real small crankbaits in them. And if you're in that clay stained water, you're going to want to stick like with these. Red with black, red. You want to match the water, or you want to go white, completely white. So anybody who's ever, fished a pond that maybe isn't always red stained year round or stained year round, it gets clear. You'll notice that if you get a big flood, lots of rain comes in, get a lot of runoff, your water goes completely stained, chocolate milk, red, whatever. And you start catching fish a couple days later. And all of a sudden they look like they're ghosts. I mean, just devoid of pigment. if that light penetration can't get into the water, those fish will turn colors like that. I mean, literally in a couple of days. So if you're in red water and you're not using bait, stick with something that can make a little bit of noise that you can run through, and then white. So white curly tail grubs, twin tail grubs, something, maybe even a ghost type grub, something like this. Again, these are kind of your basic, what you see in your basic starter kits for sunfish at any type of sporting goods store. When you get into more stained water, so not really red clay, but dingy, there's you can kind of maybe see a couple inches down, but there's just a lot of silt sediment floating around. That's when you want to start going for your chartreuses. So things like this, anything on this bottom row up here, and then you might elect for, an orange or a red or something like that. But in stained water that isn't always stained, chocolate milk ponds are typically a byproduct of their clear. You get a lot of rain, you get runoff, you get inflow, they stain for a few weeks, the sediment settles. Now your clay lined ponds that just stay stark orange, stark red year round, those ones you can't really do anything about. So if you're not fishing bait, then you got to go red or you got to go white, or something that's really, really dark. So I showed those tubes. Well, here's a little mud bug that is also kind of like that tube. It's another crappie max. I don't know what these are called. I think they're called like river bugs or something like that, but they're the same size. They're like 1.5 inches, 2 inch. But you want to stick with like this green pumpkin with red and black in clear. This color works in every type of water in Oklahoma, whether it's crystal clear or chocolate milk or red stained. A little box that's got your green pumpkins in it, that's always going to help you just catch more fish if you're using artificials. But the rule of thumb is chocolate milk, chartreuse, whites, natural colors. Clear water, only natural colors. So dark natural colors. Green pumpkin, black and blue, watermelon. And then if you're in clay stained water, red, especially dark red, crawfish red, black back, brown back with the red through it, or just completely white. You'll notice if you try to catch sunfish using artificial on clear water, like really clear water, it's tough if you're not using either natural bait or using some type of natural color. Especially when you get into, boxes like with the starter kits where you get these obnoxious colors. These are not going to help you. These are not going to work very well in clear water. Clear water, you want to keep it natural. Let's see here. So kind of went through, I showed one of the boxes. Here's one of something like this. This is, even though they're bright, this is kind of a natural coloration. In any body of water, it's going to mimic shad, bait fish, things like that. So again, we got like our pearl whites, our kind of light blues, electric chicken. This one can be a good one. Some chartreuse, and then we have kind of our darker colors, our black and pink, our black and blue, and then like some gold shiners, things like that. So you go to any bait and tackle shop, you got 4,000 options of colors that you can pick for all of these things that are essentially the same thing. Bluegill, just, at this time of year, they're probably the most aggressive of spawning fish. If I had to pick a fish that will literally just attack because their beds are clustered together, any pulsation that's in the water, they have all the other male fish, right? So big cluster of beds. Those male fish are swimming between beds, stealing pebbles and hard debris from the middle of other beds to bring back to their beds. So they're just really just aggressive and active. They're just constantly on alert because they're in such a confined quarter. So that's a big thing with fishing for bluegill, red ear, green sunfish, long ear sunfish in small bodies of water. Creeks are going to be a little bit later. Those are going to start kind of in June, late May, early June. Bigger reservoirs are going to be from right now, but probably really getting good in like 2 weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks from now. But most of the ponds in the state of Oklahoma right now ought to be really good for any type of sunfish. But just kind of keeping that in mind when you go out of find fish. So whether you're throwing artificials or bait, keep moving around until you find fish. This is the time of year that when you, especially if the water is somewhat clear and you can see the beds, go right to where those bedding areas are. If you don't see fish physically on the bedding area, then cast just out past it. But this is the time of year to take somebody new fishing, introduce a family member, one of your kids' friends, one of your friends, one of your work colleagues. This is the best month of year to fish in Oklahoma, always. You're going to be dealing with a little bit of delayed crappie spawn. You're going to have bass spawning and then kind of post spawn, and they're really active. And then your sunfish are moving up, and then your channel cats, especially in ponds, they're going to be pushing up as well. So you're going to have this whole buffet of fish that are trying to, just eat and feed and spawn and do everything in the shallow water. So you don't need a boat, don't need a kayak, you don't need a float tube. You can bank fish all of May in Oklahoma and have immense success for a multitude of species. So it's the perfect time of year to just take other people fishing, because you're going to catch a lot of fish. And, there's nothing worse than taking people out fishing and, you don't get a bite or you don't. So with sunfish in particular, especially on small bodies of water or creeks, or if you're on a big body of water and you're in a cove or you're in a marina, or, you're along a kind of shallow shelf on a shoreline, keep moving yourself until you get bit. And then once you get bit, cast it right back to the same spot. You get bit again. If you're just there to park your cooler and your lawn chairs and hang out for the day, that's the spot you need to be in. Because once you find one, like I said, they spawn in most cases, even in small ponds, they're going to spawn in the hundreds. On certain bodies of water, they're going to spawn in the thousands. So you can literally just get yourself in one spot and the bite won't lull at all during the day. You're just going to be constantly having fish pushing up, sucking out, pushing up, sucking out, in that little tiny, it could be as small as like a 10-foot circle, and they're there all day. So that's the biggest thing with catching sunfish at this time of year. Keep moving until when you throw it out on the water, it's like 5, 10, 15 seconds, fish on. 5, 10, 15 seconds, fish on. And then stay right there. Don't move unless you're fishing a body of water that you're familiar with and you're like, okay, there's bedding areas here, but there's also bedding areas, then move between bedding areas. But all these fish are going to be congregated in the same real tight circles right now at this time of year. So with that, let's see, another good one I'm kind of partial to is I like rooster tails a lot, especially for your panfish. So sunfish, again, bluegill, smallmouth, red ear, smallmouth, green sunfish, a little bit bigger. If you get the right type of cross, whether it's a green red or a green blue, sometimes they take on the body characteristics and the coloration of the green sunfish. Other times they get just their mouth gets just a little bit bigger. So that's helpful. But when you fish something like this, look where the hook point is at versus the back of your bait, right? So when I was talking about using live bait like a worm or a kernel of corn or crappie nibble, you want it right there, right where the hook turns. You don't want it, here's the back of our bait. That's tough. You get a big bluegill that's got a mouth like that. Well, he swims up behind it and he gets it and it's like there, and you're just feeling peck, peck, peck on the end of your line. So you're setting the hook. Well, again, look where that hook point's at. He's nowhere near it. So when you're fishing artificials, especially when your hook point is that far in front, I mean, that's almost 2 inches in front of the back of that bait. So you want to be fishing as slow as possible. That's why I use like 1/32 ounce hooks, 1/64 ounce hooks, things that just barely sink. So I can reel as slow as I can go, and maybe just subtly popping the rod tip as I'm just slowly going. And then you'll kind of feel that, pause or a nick in the line where it'll, you don't feel the dink, dink, dink. You just kind of feel like the line just kind of goes, and I'll pause. And then I'll sit there and I'll see if my line will move. And if my line moves, that means the fish got it from here to back here when that line starts to go. So when you're using artificials where the hook point is that far in front of the back of the bait, when you get bit, you can't fish slow enough. Just as slow as you can go. And then when you feel that little nick on the line, give it a second. Not 10 seconds, but just kind of pause and then watch the tip of your rod tip and then watch where your line meets the water. If that line is gaining slack or it's moving in either direction, then, reel up until you feel tension and set the hook. But that's the hard thing. So using things like rooster tails, where your hook point is on the back of the body of the hook. So I kind of have a box of a bunch of them. They're kind of tangled up here. We'll try to separate one. So I really like this color, which is just kind of a, golden brown, and then an olive green. So this one right here is like a Warden's Vibrick rooster tail. And then this is just a basic Yakima Bait Company standard cylindrical body rooster tail. Both of these are 16th ounce. They're not very big. Love these. These are just straight cast out, steady retrieve. If you're fishing around like heavy vegetation or things like that, you obviously want to run them on the outside, or if there's grass on the bottom, you want to be right above. But with a few casts with something like this, you're going to kind of feel your way around of what the structure and cover is, but just cast it straight out and just a slow, steady retrieve. Just enough so where the tip of your rod tip has kind of just a slight bend in it, because when this inline spinner is going, it's going to create that vibration, and you're going to feel that on the end of your rod tip. So it shouldn't feel like loose, like it's swimming through the water. So basically what I do is I'll cast it out, and the second it hits the water, when I snap my bail, I kind of almost do like a mini hook set before I start reeling, like throw it out, snap the bail, and kind of swing, and that gets the blade spinning. And then I just reel as slow as I can reel while still keeping that spinning. It'll take you, if you're not familiar with rooster tails, it might take you a few casts to kind of get the hang of the feel of what it feels like when the blade is spinning, but you have to keep the blade spinning. And then there's some other colors, that you can go for. This is kind of where I live over here. You can see I have the most of the browns and the green, and then some black and some white and gold. But then you have your other colors. You get some black with some white, some pink, some trout color, and then some other not rooster tails, but kind of like fish head inline spinners. They all work. I'm a big fan of quantity with quality mixed in, but I'll always take quantity over quality any day of the week. I hate not catching fish, so I'm a huge advocate of, if you're fishing artificials, keep it as natural as possible. Natural colorations, natural bait profiles. A lot of times if I go to a new body of water, a new pond, a new reservoir, something like that, I will use, a small worm or a crappie nibble, and I will catch bait fish on purpose. Like I'm trying to catch as small a fish just so I get a bait profile. Bluegill, sunfish, bait fish, they don't look the same on every body of water. Depending on water clarity, sunlight penetration into the water, genetics, things like that, those fish are going to look a little bit different. So if I'm using artificial, well, I want to match my artificial as closely as I can to the natural prey source that I find, whether that be, bugs if I'm picking up rocks, or crawfish or bluegill or shad or whatever. I'm looking to match as closely as I can on that body of water if I'm using artificial. Like I said, you can't outfish bait. So a worm, a cricket, kernel of corn, crop, you can't outfish that. You're not going to catch more total numbers. You're not going to get bit more often, but you can get pretty close at this time of year with things like the squirm and squirt tube that I showed you, little baby shad like this. You can get close. You will get bit almost as often, but you won't catch as many total number of fish. You're just going to eliminate a lot of the small fish, right? So like I showed you, the hook point on this is, at least 2 inches from the back of the bait. Well, if you have a kernel of corn or a little piece of worm on the end of that, well, you're going to catch a 3-inch sunfish on that all day long. So if you're fishing a pond where you're like, I don't want to catch 4-inch sunfish, then going to something like a baby shad or a little river bug, something like this on a very small 32nd ounce jig head. The squirm and squirt tube that I showed you guys, something like that. Obviously, I destroyed him for context when we were talking about that, but something like that. That's going to get you real close. And then all of the other stuff, your basic starter kits, these are going to catch fish at this time of year. So beetle spins. But I'm all about quantity. So everything that I talk about in these segments, I'm just trying to help you catch as many fish as possible. Whereas if you want to catch a real big fish, if you want to eliminate, well, then you size up a little bit. So we can talk about that right now, like a grub box. So you might have a box where you have a bunch of curly tail, different types of grubs in there. We have our white ribbed curly tail. This is a fairly substantial grub. I mean, you hold it out like that. Well, you're looking at 3 inches. It's probably labeled as a 2.5 inch because they probably go to where the turn is, not where it comes on the back. But if you're going to use curly tail grubs, things like this, sunfish are pretty easy. They go for flashy. They go for, like I said, they're very, very aggressive for most of the year. Outside of November, December, January, February, early March, where they really kind of hunker down to structure and they really are only going to go after either natural bait or really, really closely matching natural, artificial colors. They'll go for stuff like this all summer long. From here through September, you can tear anything like this. So if you're going to use a grub, the one thing that I see as kind of a mistake to make with these artificials is when you get a grub. So all grubs that are curly tails, they're going to look something like this. But how do you rig them? So you decide your jig head. I only have big jig heads in here. So we have an 1/8 ounce jig head right here. So if you're going to like a creek or a river, let's say you're going to Blue River. You want to go catch some smallmouth bass, some spotted bass, some long ear sunfish, some bluegill. When you rig these, the back of your tail, where it comes off right there, so the fat part of the tail down the back, that's the back of the bait. Your hook point needs to come out the top of the bait. So when you put it in the nose and you work that grub on, you want to come right down. You can't see it on the computer screen, but on these soft plastics, there's a line where they clamp the plastic together. So when it comes out of the mold, there's a vertical line that runs down both sides to the tail. So when you work that up the body or the shank of the hook, you want to come right out on that front line. So when your grub's sitting on there, if you held it like this, the tip of the tail is like the hook point, right? So when it swims through the water, it's just doing this. But you don't want that hook point coming out the bottom, because then when it swims, doesn't mean you won't catch fish that way. You're just, it's going to look funny. It's not going to swim as well, things like that. So that's a big thing to remember if you fish grubs. Make sure you're coming out to where the back of the tail, when your hook point, it looks the same as your hook point, right? It's faced the same direction, looks just the same. So that's something to pay attention to. That will help you catch more total fish. Doesn't mean you can't catch fish rigging it the other way. But this is a pretty stock box of, like, if you wanted to go creek fishing in Oklahoma, anything in there, you're going to catch fish. Whites, I'm partial again, I'm going to use something like this, a little root beer pumpkin flake, or you have heads that have like the Roadrunner heads on them, or an offset arm like this that you might, attach to a jig head, like a beetle spin, something like that. They're all going to help you catch fish. But with sunfish at this time of year, keep it to bait, keep it natural. You're going to catch the most amount of fish, but throwing, you could throw anything that's in this box and you're going to catch fish. So we have our marabou jigs and our bucktail jigs that, look something like that. You can straight swim them. You can tie it on, just swim it through the water. You could put this underneath the bobber. That's another thing. All these grubs and everything else that I've shown tubes, you can do the same thing that you would with your, worm and a bobber. Hook it up below, let it sit out there. Waves will pulsate it, wind, current, whatever. And then every now and then, just jig the top of your rod, and the bobber will be sitting on the water, shoot forward, and your, whatever your offering is that's tied to it below the water is going to kind of swing and then fall. And that might be enough for a fish, because a lot of times, you'll throw something out there like a kernel of corn or a worm, and you can see the fish come up to it and eat it. But a lot of times you'll see a whole bunch of them. You see like 15 fish come right up to where your hook's at, and they're all kind of looking at it, and then all of a sudden a brave one comes up and boom, hammers it. That same thing happens. You get out into water and you're fishing, below a float. Sometimes all it takes is just a little jigging action to move that bobber, which moves your lure under the water. And that little bit of movement, when it settles, that's where the bite comes. Typically more associated with crappie, but it does sometimes get bigger, finicky sunfish to bite, because they'll just stay right next to it. They can, especially with bait, they can smell it. Here's a couple of colors that I like. Here's a little small kind of 2-inch curly tail, got a black and yellow body, kind of like a bumblebee with a little pink tail. Then we have a ribbed pink tube, the little pink jig head. Those work pretty well. Then you probably seen kind of like your classic, again, starter kit type deals with your beetle spins, the classic black and yellow, little offset arm, little orange and chartreuse offset arm. Again, you can't reel slow enough. Basically anything to keep it out of vegetation, out of getting snagged. You might lose a lure or two. My big kind of philosophy on fishing is, if you're not getting snagged, you're not fishing hard enough. If you have cover and structure, it doesn't matter what you're fishing for. You could be fishing for bass, crappie, catfish, sunfish, walleye, hybrid, stripers, white bass. If they are up in cover or structure, unless I know the body of water really well, or I know exactly where each little limb is, well, I already know going into it, I'm going to lose a couple of lures. But I'm going to feel my way through it. I'm going to figure out, okay, I need to cast right here. If I cast a foot this way, that means snag. But you want to be working all of these types of lures through that heavy cover, heavy structure most of the year, except for right now. Right now, find where they're bedding and then put it right on top of them. But if you're using artificials, you want to be able to reel so slow that you're just keeping it off of whatever the bottom vegetation is. So if you can reel it in as slow as you can possibly go and you don't get bit and your hook, you're completely clean, no leaves, no debris, no weeds, no scum, no nothing, perfect. Once you find fish, keep that retrieve. The slower you go, the more fish you're going to, yield throughout the course of the day. Because again, a lot of them, it's not a feed bite, it's an attack bite. It's a predatory, get away from my bed, get away from my fry, get away from my eggs. Hey, I'm coming up to spawn. This looks like an easy meal, from a female who's out in deeper water. They come up. So a lot of times they're just coming up to take a swipe at it. So the slower you can reel, the more likely chances are that fish gets it far enough in its mouth that hook point is now where you can set it. If you reel too fast, those fish will just, they'll burn by and they'll be grabbing the back of this thing as you go, but you're never on the hook point. It feels like you got bit all day. You go home frustrated thinking, man, I was on fish all day long. I just couldn't, they were probably too small, or they probably weren't too small. You were probably reeling too fast. They could never get to that hook point. All right, let's see. We've gone through. Here's another kind of basic box. Again, a lot of starter kit stuff in here. Your blacks and chartreuses. This is a pretty good box right here as far as colors go. Anything in there, I would say, is going to yield pretty good results. Got a couple of little baby swim baits and chartreuse, white swim baits, some multi-tailed grubs and white, some blue and black with chartreuse, kind of your black with chartreuse. I mean, these are just very basic colorations. These are going to work, especially, you got kids. You want to take somebody new. You don't just want to bait fish all day. Somebody wants to actually throw on a hook with something and cast it out and retrieve it. Anything like that, you're going to have success. Same thing with this box. Anything like this on a 16th ounce hook, 32nd ounce hook, casting it straight off the bank in shallow coves, shallow bays, marinas, around docks, around any type of woody structure, trees that have fallen in the water, you're going to have success with those colors. Doesn't mean you're going to outfish your worm in a bobber, or cricket in a bobber, or kernel of corn, or crappie nibble in a bobber, but you can get pretty close. Again, especially with those more natural colors, but chartreuses, pinks, June bugs, sunfish, you can kind of expand a lot more than you can with, maybe bass or crappie for an extended period of time. March, April, pretty tough to catch sunfish. They're going to be in that deeper water on those drop-offs in that vegetation. Now they've pushed up. They're going to do their spawning, but then they're not going to retreat back out. That's the difference. Crappie, bass, catfish, they move up, they spawn, they bump way back out to those transition areas for the most part. Not every fish. You always have fish of every species. Every fish is different. And they'll inhabit shallow water year round. But the majority of that type of species, when they spawn, they want to push back out. It gets hot in the summer. You get a thermocline. They want to live down where they're, typically where there's rapid drops. So like boat docks. If you have a boat dock where it's shallow water to deep water in like 10 feet, and it goes from 2 foot to 15 foot, and there's a bunch of debris and rocks and boulders and vegetation, well, you're going to have a whole bunch of fish that live right there year round. Easy meal. They can go out to the deep water, rest, push up to feed. Out to rest, push up to feed, and they're only going about 15 feet. Same thing happens in ponds, creeks. But with sunfish, they don't go that far. So, most of this stuff, especially from May through September, October, all these lures, all these artificials that we're showing, they'll work, through that time. Went through that one, went through the crankbaits. Then the only other, you might try like little rattle traps. Again, these are like those little crankbaits I showed earlier. Just something flashy, little blue back and silver, a little black back and silver, just a little white and red and black, or a little like super duper or a bladed bait, just something that's really small. Again, just as slow as you can reel it while keeping the natural vibration of what the lure is meant to do. So for these, they kind of keep their head down and they dig and they shake just fast enough to keep where you can feel that with the tip of the rod tip. And that's going to get the most bang for your buck. So with that kind of takes me through everything that I have bait-wise and artificial. I'm going to transfer over to some of the fly fishing things that you can use. So if anybody has any questions at this point of what we've talked about, if you have questions about specific bodies of water, how to fish, please start plugging them in. We'll do it again right at the end, but I'm going to move on to the fly fishing stuff if nobody's got any questions on that. But like I said, your big thing with fishing either with bait or artificials at this time of year, find the spawning beds first. Your spawning beds on a pond, if it's less than 2 acres, look for maybe a point that comes out, and on the northern side where, if the wind's blowing from the south, is kind of protected. That's probably where you're going to find a lot of your bedding areas. Or if you have a pond that, is maybe long ways west to east, north, south, they're probably going to spawn on the southern side because all that wind gets pushed into the northern banks, but it misses those southern banks when it drops over. So that tip, they want to spawn in shallow, sheltered water where they're least susceptible to predation from typically largemouth bass or crappie, maybe even channel catfish, especially in smaller bodies of water. Recently moved grandkids out. The best lakes in the Tulsa area to do so. So Tulsa, you got a lot of great water around you. All of the small bodies of water, the Tulsa urban fisheries. So if you go to wildlifedepartment.com, click on close to home waters, there's a dozen close to home or Tulsa urban fishing areas that are listed. The Jinx Veterans Pond is a good one in Tulsa, but go to wildlifedepartment.com, click on the fishing link and go to close to home areas, and then look at Tulsa, Jinx, Bartlesville. There's lots of really good small bodies of water around to fish. And then obviously you have the Arkansas River, probably not great for sunfish, but good fishery. Then you have Keystone. And then just a little bit to your east, you have like Barren Fork Creek, Illinois River. Those are all great sunfish fisheries, as well as smallmouth bass and things like that. Sunfish at Canton, your areas around those marinas. So a lot of those fishing jetties that go out off of the south side where the dam's at, where they, you get some backwater that fills in, that's going to be good sunfish spawning habitat. The eastern side of the lake. So when you get to Canton, you drive across the dam, and then you have the core camp area that's right there. I think it's called like Sandy Cove or something. There's a lot of real shallow bays that come back into that area, and there's brush. That's where your sunfish are going to, primarily spawn at. And then again, on the western end of the lake, there's the major boat ramp that's there that's got the cove that goes back in. But any reservoir that you're on, but Canton, I wouldn't consider a major reservoir, but it's certainly it's a good sized one for Oklahoma. You're looking at just the 4 foot of water or less in the offshoot arms or bays, or if there's a fishing jetty where water can come back in, especially, on that south side on the dam, you get a lot of protection in there because most of the time the wind's coming up over the top of that dam. You're 40 feet down from the top of it on those fishing jetties. So that wind doesn't even really hit the water until it's already 20, 30 yards past you. So the dam, where you have those jetty inlets that come in, those would be good spots for sunfish. And, this being just sunfish, if you go to Canton, some of the stuff we talked about already, some of these little chartreuse grubs, you're going to catch walleye, you're going to catch white bass, you're going to catch hybrid striped bass, you might even catch a largemouth bass, you're going to catch crappie. So those would be the places to focus on any body of water, but definitely major reservoirs. You're looking for creek arms, inlet jetties, marinas, anything that gets wind breaks. So when the wind is howling, if you see parts of the body of water back in those arms or coves that are still, that's where your spawning activity is going to be. Now, if you're looking for some of the bigger fish that have maybe either not gotten to spawn or have already spawned and they kind of pop back out, then those points that come out of where those shallow protected areas are, especially if you have grass flats. So if you're out on a boat or a kayak, if your electronics can pick up grass mats, if it's clear enough where you can see into the water, in like 8 to 12 feet of water, that down right at the bottom, if you have brush piles mixed in with, bottom vegetation, that's where you're going to find some really, really, big sunfish year round. But definitely right before they spawn and then right after they spawn. And then from now until October. And then once we get into November, December, January, February, March, they're still there. Some of them might even kick out to a little bit deeper water if they have a safe travel route, between that, or if the grass or weeds dies out in the winter weather. But, that's where the majority of your big fish are going to hang out. They love just like a big stump with lots of grass vegetation that grows around it. That's where you're going to find your big fish in like 8 to 12 feet of water year round. But look for those areas that are really, really close to good spawning habitat. So any type of protected creek arm, bay, anything like that. All right. So I think that takes care of the questions, unless anybody's got anything else. We'll go into kind of fly fishing. So you got a lot of options for fly fishing for sunfish. At this time of year, I'd keep it subsurface. As we get into June and July, you can definitely start working the top water in the same areas right around their spawning beds, because you're going to have these fish, they're going to spawn. Eggs take a few days to incubate. Then the fry got to grow and they get a little bit of parental care. So you're going to have fish on these bedding areas for the next 6 to 8 weeks, because not all fish spawn at the same time. You're going to have a big bulk of the fish come up at one time, but you're going to have early spawners, you're going to have late spawners. So you're going to have a forage base that's around these bedding areas until the middle of June. So you're always going to have bass and crappie and catfish and big sunfish hanging out to predate on the smaller sunfish that are spawning, as well as their eggs and their fry. So right now in May, keep it mostly subsurface. So a box like this, we have like over here, we have like some carry specials. These are real good. These are kind of like the tubes that I showed you. So, this has just kind of got like a basic olive body with a little bit of red copper tied through it to give it a little bit of weight. And then, just some darker olives and greens and browns. But what you're looking for when you're fishing for sunfish with a fly rod, especially with, little bugs, whether it be, something that you were trying to strip like this, or like a woolly bugger, something like this, another smaller, this is another good one, little woolly bugger. These ones you're just stripping through the water. So you're just, you're false casting out. You probably want to get maybe 15 feet past the bedding area, let it hit the water. Now, something like this, that's going to take, I'm probably going to do a 3 or a 5 count to let it sink. This one's a little bit heavier. It's got some copper tied around it, a little bit more dense of a body. It's going to sink a little bit faster. So you just got to figure that out in your head. How deep is it? How long do I want it to sink? And then it's just quick strip, maybe a little like 1, 2, 2, 3-inch pull. Let it settle. 2, 3-inch pull. Because what you're looking for, very rarely, again, because where the hook point is at, do you get bit when you're reeling, when you're stripping. You get bit in the pauses in between. So it's bam, bam. This thing shoots through the water like this, where it's like, and then it just kind of does that. Well, during that pause, that's when that fish comes up and it grabs it. Well, so what you're looking for, you want to use floating line for sunfish. There's no need. You're not fishing in deep enough water to need sink tip line. You shouldn't have any added weight on your line, a bead-headed woolly, any type of bead head, whether it be a nymph or a woolly bugger or some type of other type of stripping fly. You shouldn't need added weight. You're fishing in, 2 to 6 feet of water. But what you're watching for is your floating fly line. You don't really need a huge leader. It's not trout fishing. So just a basic 9-foot leader, maybe tie on like 6 inches to a foot of, I would go with like 4X, like 9-foot 4X leader, and then tie on, maybe 5X tippet or 6X tippet, like just enough chew line so you don't cut into your leader. But you don't need to have a big 15, 16-foot leader like you would if you were fly fishing for trout out west, where you're trying to match the hatch. You're not trying to match anything. You're just trying to stimulate predators with things that look natural to them. This could be a little bait fish. This could be, that's what you're looking for. So your other smaller bugs, I have to go to my other box, but I've caught sunfish on just about every fly in my box that is size 12 or smaller. So it doesn't really matter. It's just, things that are more natural, like a pheasant tail, like a little bead-headed pheasant tail. This is a bigger one. This is probably that's at least a 12 or 14. That's a pretty big nymph. You can use a float. So you could use a strike indicator and, just like if you were fishing with spinning equipment or bait casting or spin casting, if you're bobber jigging for crappie or sunfish, where your bobber is going across the top of the water, like this, you could do the same thing. If you have your strike indicator on for your fly line, yeah, you could just, you could throw on like a little Bloody Mary like this, or, a little lightning bug, something with a little bit of flash in it. And let that go 2 feet below your strike indicator, and just occasionally give it a good 6-inch strip and let that bobber do that. And then your fly's in the water but I like to have contact. I don't think you're going to gain anything from doing that. So just throwing this out without a strike indicator, and again, doing the same thing you would with woolly bugger or a little stripper fly, like just throw it out there, count it down 2-3 seconds, and then just, a couple of quick 2-3-inch bursts of the fly line, and then pause, bam, 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 1 or 2 seconds in between. But what you're looking for is that fly line sitting right on the top of the water, that floating line where it connects to your leader. All you're watching is the end of that fly line, because what's going to happen is during that pause, you're going to see your fly line do something like that. Or, maybe it has tension in it and it kind of lets up, or it kind of twitches. That's all you're watching for. Because like I said, you're probably not going to feel it during the strip. So you're just, if that fly line does anything, but most of the time it just kind of starts to slowly, shoot away from you. Well, then you just go right up. You can either strip it straight in, or depending on how much false casting you did, how much extra line you have off of the reel, then you might just put it on the reel and go in. But these are kind of my go-tos if I'm going to fly fish. I like a very, very small, this is going to be like a size 16, size 14 hook for a little tiny, brown with a little bit of flash, woolly bugger. Let's see what else we got. Lots of Lots of different flies. Again, we're not trying to match the hatch on anything. You might have a little rubber-legged yellow Sally. These are solid everywhere. You can throw these in creeks. Creeks for smallmouth. Doesn't want to focus there very well, but if I put it back in the box. But like down in this corner, we got some big yellow Sallies. The little rubber-legged one I put back in there. But we have like some crackback caddis down here, little rubber leg copper john, some bigger Bloody Marys, a little lightning bug next to it. But then once you get into like, middle of June, water temps come up, they've already spawned. Then you might start looking at something like a little floating ant, little size 14, 16, 18 ant. Basically size 12 and smaller. When you get to top water, you probably want to go even smaller. You want to be like 14, 16, 18s, 12. But again, Oklahoma for hatching, like here's little mayfly. This is a pretty big one. Like if I was fishing for trout out west, like in Montana or Wyoming, like that's pretty big. This is going to be like a 14. If I'm in Montana, I'm going with like a 20, 18 at least. But something like that. This is going to be a little mayfly hatch. Those are your natural bugs in Oklahoma. Lots of mayflies. In the fall, you're going to have your caddis. March, you're going to have your caddis. But little stimulators, again, sunfish. If you can cast around where there's like overhead cover, trees, brush, bushes, anything like that, cast through it, wind blows these bugs off. So like a little hopper, little stimulator, little elk hair caddis. Here's like a big olive body elk hair caddis. Anything that just kind of looks like it got blown off of a branch, whether it was a hopper or cricket or anything like that. So like here's some really, really small, like size 14 kind of like stimulator bugs. That you can just throw out there. Again, you're on still water. You don't have the luxury of current moving it. So you don't really have to worry about it kind of staying still all that often. Throw it on the water, even with top water for, warm water species, you kind of want to slap it down on the water. With fly fishing for trout, you want to land that thing perfectly, like it barely, doesn't even make a riffle, because all you're trying to do is imitate a fly subtly landing on the water to lay its eggs and then pick back up, for the most part, unless you're fishing like a cripple hatch or some emergers or something like that. But for just basic top water, you're looking on still water for panfish and bass. Slap that thing on the water, especially terrestrials, hoppers, ants, stimulators. That's something that's been blown off the bank that is now somewhere that it shouldn't be. So what does that bug do when it hits the water? It can't land and lift off to lay its eggs. So it's scrambling on the water. It knows it's in trouble. So slapping that fly down on the water. And then if you let it sit there for a minute, just give it a little twitch. Create a little bit of a wake, especially I think there are some foam bodies in here. If you can fish something that's got a foam body, that it's always going to stay afloat. If you're using like a stimulator, little bug, little elk hair, then you obviously have to put some floating on it. And if you give it too much action when it's on the water, you're going to get it too wet and too diluted, and it's going to start to sink on you. But even something like this, it's a pretty decent little bug right there, little hopper. That's got a rubber body on it and kind of a little cone head. That this is very buoyant, so it doesn't really need floating on it. But that's going to be about the size of your very small panfish, like Betts poppers, fly fishing poppers that they make. If you fly fish, you've seen those at Cabela's and Bass Pro and Academy. They come in like a little box. But you don't want to get much bigger than that. Then you have like little poppers. So there's another one. It's got a rubber body on it, so it floats. But then the front of it is more like a bass popper. It's got that hard kind of plastic fiberglass that's on it with the concave on the front. So you actually are meant to chug this one. So, but again, we're probably a few weeks away. It's not to say that you couldn't get some sunfish. You probably definitely get bass to come up. But your sunfish are still a few weeks away, maybe a month away. Typically, once they finish their spawning cycle, that's when they really start to focus their attention towards the surface because they're looking for berries. This year, we have a big cicada hatch in Oklahoma. So you're going to see a lot of cicadas coming out that are going to be on the water. So for bass, panfish, crappie, catfish, carp, most people don't think of dry fly or dry in top water anything for carp, but wait until you get a good cicada hatch and then watch carp coming in the shallows. So, any type of cicada looking bug that you can throw up on the top is going to yield some results. But that's kind of all I got for sunfish. So we got a half an hour left, and I'll stay the whole time if people have questions to ask. Otherwise, I don't have any new information to give. So this is kind of the time of these segments where if you're done, if you got everything you need to know, I can't see the individuals who are in here, but I can see how many people are in here. So typically if I get down to 0, I'll end the stream, but I don't have any new information to give. So we'll open it up for questions if you got questions. But like I said, if you're done, if you've got everything you need, go ahead and hop off. This will be live on this YouTube channel as well as on our website, wildlifedepartment.com, 10 minutes after I end the live stream. So if you come back and you're like, oh, there's 10 more minutes, well, you can just watch the 10 minutes at the end. So go ahead and hop off if you don't have any questions. Otherwise, I'll sit here and I'll give it a couple of minutes to see if questions come off. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and end the stream. So fire away your questions or hop off, and we appreciate you being here. Hopefully this helped out. Got a new article on sun fishing with a couple of instructional videos at wildlifedepartment.com. Those will be live on the main page of our website tomorrow. So another resource for sun fishing, as well as all of our other Ask an Angler. Our next one is going to be in early June for spawning catfish. So if you're interested in bank fishing for channel cats and blue cats, that'll be a good one to get some tips and tricks for. But yeah, so doesn't look like we have any questions coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and end this stream if nobody's got anything. I'll put my contact information over here in the chat bar just in case anybody needs it. It was in the email link that was sent to you all with my email and my phone number. Text or email is going to get you the quickest response. Typically phone calls go to voicemail, and I try to return those in the evenings when people have time to talk. And then always be sure to visit wildlifedepartment.com and go to our fishing resources page. There's always up to date information for fishing tips for the season, our Outdoor Oklahoma Journal, our articles, things like that. I'm always updating it. So there's always new content that's going on there that's relevant to the time of year of the species that are available to catch. So, but feel free to reach out to me at any time if you ever have any questions or you just want to talk shop about fishing or need a place to go, need help finding somewhere to go, where public access, where bait shops are. Reach out to me. That's what I'm here for. So thank you all for coming. Remember, the outdoors are always open. We just had Mother's Day weekend. We got Father's Day weekend coming up. This next 4 to 6 weeks for sunfish, especially on close to home water, small city lakes, private ponds, farm ponds, neighborhood ponds. This is the best fishing window of the year. Right from right now, I know the weather's bad outside today. It'll turn around here in a day or two, but even on a day like today, you can still probably go out to a small body water, a pond, and just get into fish. It's just the water temperatures are there. Like I said, it's been a weird spring. Lots of fish have had delayed spawns. So they're pushing in, pushing out, pushing in, pushing out. So you just kind of have this conglomerate of different species of fish all trying to do the same thing at the same time in the same place. That's great for anglers. Not so great for fish. We're probably going to have not so great spawning classes on certain bodies of water this year. But that happens. That's just nature. Happens every year all over the state. This year we just happen to have some funky weather. It might affect it more broad scale than usual, but the fishing's good. So get out there, catch fish, take somebody new. wildlifedepartment.com. Make sure to check out our fishing resources page. My information's in the chat bar. You ever have questions, reach out to me. Be happy to answer any fishing questions or point you in the right direction to get you where you need to go. So with that, thank you, and we'll see you at the next one.